Welcome back to The Marketing Moment with DB Dynamo. I'm your host, David Barry, and joined once again with Julia Reynolds. So we've spoken to Nicole, and she has said that she's missing each of you, but she's going to step back from the day-to-day on our podcast and instead help work on writing some of the content. So a lot of what you're going to hear in the digital dash and the marketing muscles and malfunctions will still come from Nicole. But your co-hosts moving forward, lucky you, me and Julia. So Julia, welcome back, of course. And I know everyone's excited to hear from you too.
Yep. It's good to be here.
It is. So we're gonna dive right in with a little bit of a consolidated episode today, but the focal point is for us to talk about apparel and footwear. We're gonna kind of touch on each of those a little bit, and the core of this is gonna be focusing on a case study with an apparel client of ours named Paskho, a fashion startup based out of New York, from fashion industry legend Patrick Robinson, who was named one of Vogue's 100 Rising Stars. We'll talk a little bit more about him in a minute, but before we get there, we've got, as I'd mentioned, some consolidated content today. We're going to start off with our digital dash and one headline for you today. So Julia, tell them what's going on with TikTok and a little bit of copycats.
Yeah. So per Instagram copying Snapchat, we now have TikTok copying Instagram, copying Snapchat. TikTok is introducing stories. So TikTok announced that they are piloting their own version of stories, an additional avenue for users to share creative content that will disappear after 24 hours. Typical of most stories. RIP Twitter's fleets. the death of stories.
Oh man, we miss them so much.
We do.
If we ever saw one.
I never did, but okay, I miss it in spirit, you know. So here's how it differs. Rather than a list of private story views and with your replies going straight to the poster's DMs, TikTok stories will show user comments on the story itself alongside an additional tab where users can see who viewed any given story. So I kind of like the community vibe. Definitely an interesting twist. What do you think?
I actually like that twist because yes, it's a copycat feature, but what's nice about it is I think it prevents creepers. Mm-hmm. If we're being honest, that's kind of one of the things that frustrates a lot of people about a lot of these channels is you have the ability to message people privately. And there's obviously an advantage to that. But based on the way that these channels sort of operate, it's like, do you really want to say that? Because everybody's going to see it. But I actually think that's the reason this is different is it's going to make the content much more interactive in a way that it usually has not been. So stories have largely just been it's a public facing thing, but it's where people will interact with you more one-to-one, but no one else sees it. So I think that's an interesting twist to make stories a more community oriented, to use your language, type of format and get people to buy into that content and maybe spend a little bit more time with it. So at first I didn't realize that was the twist. If it is, then I think this is different enough that it's got a chance at sticking and having people interact with it. And what I'm curious about is to see how that's going to differ from the quote unquote normal content that we've gotten used to on the channel and what the rate of adoption will be compared to, normal feed videos and how the algorithm is going to prioritize them. But all conversations that we'll answer in due time, but this is different enough for a channel where I think it'll work.
I agree. But however, if you want to try it out, it's not yet rolled out in the United States. It's in a small number of countries outside of the US, according to TikTok, where they're trying to gain insight and everything before they roll it out across.
Totally noted. Well, I will be on the lookout. And as our resident TikTok expert, I'm sure Julia will be among the first to show you how it works and if it works.
Yeah, 1000%. So
awesome. Perfect.
Right. That's our digital dash.
Nice and easy for you guys today. Well, I will dive into our main segment, our entree, which is, as I'd mentioned, we're talking about apparel and footwear today. And, a lot of times we talk about things philosophically and, as examples of trends and patterns in the industry. This one is going to be a little bit more case study oriented, and curious to see, the general response that we might get from this, because I know if you're listening, the hope is that you're trying to get some actionable information that you can use on your own businesses. Now, sometimes that's, as I mentioned, philosophical, but today, if you whip out the pen and pad and take some notes, I think you'll get some things you can actually go implement in some of your own campaigns. So I'll start at the top. So I mentioned, Patrick Robinson, fashion industry legend. And when I first met him, I was, kind of intimidated, not because I knew anything about fashion. Anybody who knows me knows that I probably know very little. But when I found out the things he'd been involved in, I, kind of got a little timid. But he was named one of Vogue's 100 Rising Stars. He was widely credited for turning around the Giorgio Armani Collezioni line several years ago. And then he launched Gap's 1969 premium denim line along with Gap Sport. So like those all came from Patrick Robinson. And then this is something I know a lot of people will think is cool, but he co-chaired the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Costume Institute Gala with Oprah and Anna Wintour before launching Paskho in 2013. So that's frankly where we come in, not in 2013, but several years later, actually in 2018. The brand had launched with a modest, launch, a mild repute. People were aware of the brand and certainly aware of Patrick, but it had not, gained traction at mainstream, perhaps the way that, anybody would hope would be the case. Everybody who starts a new business wants to make, millions overnight, and rarely does it work that way. So we were brought in 2018, and our job was to oversee digital ad strategy and media buying efforts for this fashion startup. Now, at the time, Paskho had just finished a month where they saw about $170,000 in monthly revenue, which probably seems like a lot of money to some brands, but for those with a higher, aspiration and ambition, this was a modest number. They were really looking to scale. So in the next 6 months, this is, again, mild pat on the back, but we were able to grow revenue for the brand by 194%. In 6 months, we got up to just over 507,000 a month, but we only increased ad spend 57%. So obviously there was a huge efficiency of scale happening while they were spending more money at the same time. But again, that's not to pat ourselves on the back. The point is to eliminate, well, if we pulled that off, how did that happen? And this is the part that becomes actionable for you as marketers. First thing we did, and some of this might seem a little basic, but we continue to be surprised by how not basic some of this is, where some of these tactics and strategic approaches kind of get left on the back burner. The first thing we did was we segmented all of the customer data. Now, generally speaking, they had done enough to recognize the difference between, the male and woman shopper and how they were targeting them through ads and also in email as well. But we realized, as a lot of marketers do and brands too, that there are different subsets within their audience. So the type of person who would spend, maybe $50 on a t-shirt was a lot different than the person filling their shopping cart with $500 or $600 worth of goods and getting a whole, boatload of higher end items from the brand. So in doing so, at the beginning, at least, we keyed in on 3 key groups. The first one was the group I just alluded to, the customers who'd spent the most money with the brand. And at that point was really a measure of lifetime value. Why? Because the customers, if you want to go find customers who spend a lot of money on your brand or who might be interested in doing that, the best data indicator that still exists is your first party data on users who've already spent that kind of money with you, and then going out and finding more users who act and behave like they do. But we wanted to find those individuals for 2 reasons. Like I said, to find lookalikes of them, others who act and behave like them, but to also go back to the well and say, man, if you people are willing to spend a lot of money on this brand, there's probably a lot of other items in the shopping sphere, so to speak, that you haven't bought, haven't looked at. So let's cross-sell and upsell you on more of those items. So number 2 was customers who'd purchased most frequently. So they actually looked a little bit different than those who'd had the highest lifetime value. There's, some interesting financial research on this, and we can talk about this another day, but I'll summarize it very succinctly. Men in particular, I'm generalizing, they tend to buy a lot of items all at once in like bunches. And so like, for example, let's say that they're the Costco shoppers. They'll stock up on a bunch of things maybe once or twice a year and then never go to the store again. Women, generalizing again, will tend to buy things in more consistent increments on a day-to-day or month-to-month basis when it comes to shopping. Now, we're generalizing. This is based on first-party data that we actually got from Paskho. But what it helped us understand was, from a cash value perspective, the customer who actually buys more all at once is worth more to the brand because you get all the money sooner. And from a cash flow perspective, that's more valuable to the brand versus having to stretch it out. Both are obviously valuable because you have people who are consistently spending money with the brand and getting more items. But the reason I call out that difference is because they're different groups. So we wanted those who spent a lot of money with the brand first and foremost, but also customers who purchase more frequently because it looked like we could model an audience of people who would buy very often. So we built that as a second audience. And then the third one was people who had bought in the past. So they could theoretically be a part of groups 1 or 2, but had not purchased in the past 6 months, because we wanted to tap back into the well and say, look, here's probably a number of products that you haven't, items that you haven't seen that we would, love to put in front of you and get you to buy, because we already know that you're brand loyal. So we launched 3 separate campaigns that spoke to each of them uniquely and set those off. 2 other things we did. Number 1, we implemented dynamic retargeting and cross-selling. And at a very basic level, dynamic retargeting sounds really fancy, but at a basic fundamental level, really what it is just allowing the tools that you're advertising with to put the item that the person was shopping for back in front of them in their shopping cart. What a lot of times marketers will do, and in this case, what Paskho was doing before us was saying, you were on our website, you were looking at clothes. Well, that means we're going to show you, a shirt or a pair of pants or whatever creative it is that we decided we wanted to put in front of you. Now, you might have been looking at a very specific shirt, but you would get retargeted with a pair of pants. Okay, well, it's from the right brand, but it's not specifically what you were looking at, and therefore the relevancy is lower. So in improving the functionality of dynamic retargeting, we were able to also, like I said, cross-sell commonly added items. You see this on Amazon all the time. People who bought this top also bought this pair of pants. Those things helped us as well. And in aggregating all of it together, dynamic retargeting and the cross-selling, we increased the average order value on the site by 22% in just 2 months. Meaning, for like previously, let's say everyone was spending, $5, then they were end up spending, $6 or $7, right? In aggregate, that can add up very quickly, because even if you didn't get any new customers, you were just getting more out of the ones who bought. You're looking at a 22% improvement in revenue just by doing that. And then the third thing that we did was we re-envisioned a creative for mobile first experiences. And this was something that happened a little later in the game. And frankly, this still see a lot of advertisers doing now, where everything is like, horizontally based, like a YouTube video, but they're showing that on an Instagram story, type of feature, which means you're missing probably like 70% of the screen where you can showcase a message. So we created a bunch of mobile first creative for them as well. And ad experiences that were acknowledging which device and which screen people were looking on. So those are the first 6 months. From there, or maybe I didn't mention this, but after that, it took us another 4 months. We went from $507,000 a month in revenue to that mythical $1 million a month mark in monthly sales. So we did some of the basic things first that I just called out, but how did we get to $1 million? Beyond scaling some of the obvious things I think that we called out, we went a step further and developed even more niche modeled audiences from the top customers. So the sales data that pinpointed different like niche shopping patterns and behaviors. I talked about lookalike audiences. As we got more data in those 6 months, those first 6 months of people who were buying, there's also something to be said for the recency of purchasing behavior. So the people who bought from you more recently are better indicators of who the customer is now and the items that they're interested in now. So those lookalikes became really impactful for us. So lookalike audiences of those niche audiences we developed in those previous 6 months. Then we went with more extensive creative testing. You have the ability on a lot of digital and social channels to test numerous creative types, from visuals to copy. There's responsive ads that you can do on Google. We also can do on social media dynamic headlines, down to different iterations of still images, videos, and thumb stopping animations, which was a big part of what we did as well. And then the third thing was to narrow audiences by demographics and geos. So this is usually done a lot sooner in the process, but when we started to really get a even bigger boatload of data, we could understand where the most profitable customers were coming from a geographic perspective, and understanding that if we maybe focus some of our ad dollars in those markets, we were in theory producing or pulling in more customers who acted and behaved like our most profitable customers already. So in this case, unique differentiators between Paskho customers and the general market, from basically the locations and the other behaviors that over converted, and then use those as ways to target the individuals. This is a really random one, but I remember I worked on Party City years ago, and one of the really random things we found out about their customers is that if you were a fan of Party City, you over-indexed in preference for Nissan automobiles. It was just like a fascinating thing that like you were 2 times more likely to get a Nissan than any other brand of car if you were also a fan of Party City. Not saying that this is the exact same type of thing, but we were starting to look for those little nuances, not because we needed to understand why, but because we just needed to understand that it worked. And if it did, and it made the cash register ring, then it was sort of a no-brainer for us. And that led to further optimizations and incremental improvements in conversion rate and that average order value that continued to go up over time. So that's an oversimplification of the case study. I encourage you to pause this and go back and forth a few times to look at some of the things that we mentioned and go ahead and test them for yourself. Not everything is going to work for every brand unilaterally at all times, but in our experience, this is where you start finding the testing mixture that really does work and scale over time. A couple of other things I want to talk about briefly. We'd said apparel and footwear at the top of this show. I'm going to pivot just slightly and talk about what I think the footwear industry has taught us that e-commerce and direct-to-consumer brands should be listening to. And it's not as tactical at the ad level, but it is a little bit more tactical at the brand level. So I'll give you an example. Footwear, there's Adidas did a collaboration with Lego, for example, where there's like a Lego sneaker that those two brands created that allowed kids to have, kids in particular, but adults as well, but sneakers where there was like actual Lego pieces built into the shoe, and but not with like the painful part underneath your foot, like integrated into something that's comfy and wearable. And that's just one small example. You've seen Everlast and Yves Saint Laurent, which is a fashion brand, not to be confused with Everlast, right? But those types of collaboration opportunities have been huge in the apparel space, but really in the footwear space, where Travis Scott has gotten the most desirable Air Jordans in the market, because people know when that collaboration comes out, there's going to be a limited release and people can't wait to see them. In a sea of sameness in apparel and fashion and footwear, this is a way that brands are starting to really cement themselves and reach new audiences, is by creating unique, custom, collaborative products and opportunities that customers can't get elsewhere. And that creates number one, a degree of novelty and a degree of desirability, because never are you going to get another product like that unless you focus in on that one. But it also shows like all the different things that you can do at the product level in packaging too. So a lot of these are coming with unique boxes, which might not seem like a big deal, right? But if you buy sneakers from the same brand all the time and they're the exact same box, the unboxing experience is part of the experience, and the things that you include in it as well makes people just a little bit more likely to purchase from you if they know that something unique is going to happen in that purchase process, as opposed to just buying a regular pair of sneakers or a regular shirt from another brand. They might take a chance on something that they normally wouldn't if they get something that's a little bit different. So I wanted to call that out as just a one-off anecdote. I would love to talk about sneakers another day, because I consider myself a little sneaker collector, but I'm gonna close my mouth for a second and see, Julia, if there are any other trends or things that you're seeing in fashion and apparel, footwear as well, that you want to add to this heap, and things that for our listeners to be looking out for.
Yeah, I think we've mentioned before is the collaboration between Bad Bunny and Cheetos, which we've already seen. Bad Bunny and Crocs, Post Malone and Crocs, also a thing we've talked about before. So I think we'll see more celebrity collaborations. I feel like that's always a big thing, especially collaborations between brands, like we've mentioned, kind of like weird things you wouldn't think to be paired together. So yeah, I feel like we've seen a lot of that.
I think that's a great insight, though. Yeah, like the brand collaborations are a huge opportunity, right? Like in a sea, look, fashion is very subjective, and each brand can come out with some new iteration as often as they want. But at some point, it just becomes changing the wallpaper, right? It's just like it's just the same thing that looks slightly different. It's not all that special. But the brand collaborations are a saucy thing at the moment, where people are like, well, that's unique, that's different, or I wonder who's going to link up with who. And it just connects things where you're not expecting them to. And it also engages the ability to target and relate to new audiences that you otherwise wouldn't. I mentioned, you mentioned, Cheetos and Bad Bunny. Like, what other scenario is there where those two audiences are colliding, right? Like they probably overlap a little bit at the beginning, but it was a way to bring both brands using Bad Bunny as the brand into a public consciousness in a way that no one else was expecting. There's like right now the Saweetie meal from McDonald's is like the talk of the town. And I don't care about Saweetie. I don't care about McDonald's either, but everyone's talking about it. And there's value, obviously, when your word or your story is on the lips of people in the general public. That's how brands get shared. But nevertheless, I know we gave you a little bit of topical things, theoretical things, but hopefully you really logged in and heard some great details on some tactical things that you can do on your ads based on our Paskho case study. And in our experience, going from 170,000 a month to $1 million a month without increasing the ad spend nearly at that rate. And we did the math, just over about 6 months, our value to Paskho was $1.3 million. The gap between the ad efficiency that we had and the purchase value that they had, if without us, it was like a missing gap of $1.3 million. And we were pretty pleased with that, as I know that our client was too. And if you really want to hear it from himself, Patrick Robinson left a nice testimonial video for us on our website at dbdynamo.com. You can hear it directly from him. But that's our core segment today. Julia, I know everyone gets excited about the marketing malfunction and the marketing muzzle. Let's take us away and tell them what's going on this week.
Yes. So kicking it off with our malfunction. This is something that kind of popped up last summer and has come back. It is now, I would consider, less than a malfunction. It's been a corrected malfunction, if you will. So this is from The Guardian. It says, student proves Twitter algorithm bias towards lighter, slimmer, and younger faces. So last summer, a couple of Twitter users noticed that the Twitter image cropping algorithm, which is when you tweet a picture, it chooses a section to zoom in on and put on the timeline that a person would see before clicking on the whole image. And users realized that this algorithm has a bias towards white faces, particularly white women, and even white dogs over black dogs. And so Twitter at first said that they didn't really have this bias, but they said, we'll internally research, and they determined a slight bias towards women's faces and white faces. So then eventually they set up a quote bug bounty to allow external researchers to attempt to find this bias. And just recently, a graduate student from Switzerland, Bogdan Kulinic, sorry, Bogdan, I definitely butchered your name.
I think you did an admirable job.
Thank you. He received $3,500 from Twitter for being able to demonstrate this bias. So what he did was he used AI generated faces that he could manipulate to have darker skin tones, wider faces, more masculine or feminine faces, and ran them through the algorithm and proved that there was in fact a bias.
Wow. Yeah. I feel like I'd heard, like little murmurings of this, but that's scary, because, unconscious bias is one of the most interesting, fascinating things that is happening in all of social media. We could go down this rabbit hole entirely, but you can see how it manifests itself when, for example, Facebook discovered, I don't know if it was them or a third party, realized that 90+% of the disinformation being passed through Facebook can be pushed, basically rooted back to 12 different people on the internet. 12 people on Facebook are responsible for over 90% of its disinformation. And I imagine that there are algorithmic implications for how that happens as well, that favors certain types of faces and voices over others too. And it's a huge, monstrous conversation that I'm sure we could dedicate multiple episodes to alone. But kudos to Bogdan for being able to prove it, because I think it's one thing to think it. It's a completely different one to show them. I also think $3,500 is a gross underpayment for.
I agree.
For what he was able to prove. So I hope there's more in it for him than that. But it's major malfunction. Good to know that it was discovered. Hopefully Twitter's doing something about it.
Yeah. Well, that brings us to our muzzle. So this is pretty cute. A story from Ad Age. Delta Airlines sent a care package to cheer up a little girl named Delta. So I'm actually more familiar with the little girl named Delta. I've seen her on TikTok more than I am with Delta Airlines, which I'm pretty sure I've never flown. But this comes a direct quote from the article. For Delta V. Girardi, a 3-year-old living in Washington, D.C., the rise of the COVID-19 Delta variant meant that her name was becoming aligned with a deadly virus. So her mom, Kelly, had actually tweeted about it earlier, basically saying, why can't we go on to the next Greek alphabet letter? Why do we have to have Delta plus? Okay, what are we going to have? Delta plus plus? What is this, a programming system? Right. That's my personal commentary. She did not say that.
I like it, but it's good to have I think it's a good accurate rendering.
The sentiment is there. And Delta Airlines reached out. They sent Delta, the child, a package with airplane-shaped Delta backpack, cookies, a model plane, and a handwritten note reading, "It's the name for people who are meant to fly." So it's actually ties even cuter, because all of their content, the reason Delta is named Delta, I believe, is because her mom works in space travel. Not for NASA, oh, wow. It's a different section of space travel. But yeah, so they talk about airline travel, space travel, all kinds of cool science stuff on TikTok. So It's a very nice roundabout way.
Interesting. I mean, good for Delta. I've heard anecdotes of them doing stuff like this over time. It's a brand, you know, look, I fly American and just kind of the way it worked out. But Delta seems to be a brand in a space where not a lot of people like the bigger airlines. Southwest, you know, certainly carved out a love over there. But in the bigger players, your Deltas and your Americans, they continue to do stuff like this that it helps, you know, and it probably made this little girl's day and week. But it reminds me of all those times too, like when major hurricanes would come through, you know, our area in South Florida, and people were just, you know, really frustrated by having to be named after one.
Yeah.
Or yeah, I mean, ISIS or ISIS is a name down in, you know, in the Latin community in general that obviously had really tough implications during certain wars, and Irmas and Andrews and things like that during hurricanes. So yeah, naming is a very tough game, but kudos to Delta for helping this little girl named Delta.
Yeah, very exciting, very cute.
It is. Well, that's what we have for you today. We hope you enjoyed a slightly condensed episode. And as always, if you enjoyed what you heard, we encourage you to subscribe and listen to us as we come out every Tuesday with a new episode. And if you have peers that you think would gain, you know, information or value from what we've shared, we encourage you to share it with them too. And like I said, don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify. I've been listening to Spotify a lot lately. And also forget.
I'm big Spotify. Yep.
Yeah. And if you want to see our faces and the animation that comes from these voices, you can always check us out on YouTube as well, looking up for The Marketing Moment by DB Dynamo. Thank you again for listening, and we'll see you next week.